Hopefully you can all see that now.
Great, over
Great.
to you.
Okay. Great, yeah, so just to run you through what I'm going to be covering today. So I'll kick off by just going through what we mean by semi-structured interview, then how you plan and design semi-structured interviews, and then I'll go through some interview techniques. And hopefully this is a really practical session, because I'm assuming that either you or somebody else in your organization is going to do semi-structured interviews if that's something that you're preparing to do. So you're not reliant on anybody outside of your organization, unless that's something that you're planning on doing anyway. And also just to mention that semi-structured interviews can obviously be done in a number of different ways. I mean, the ideal scenario is you do them face-to-face, but phone interviews or interviews doing digital tools, especially and these times are just as good, as long as you get an idea of sort of either the body language or the tone of voice of the interviewee. So all of those different tools are available to you. And yeah, so just interrupt me at any time if you've got any questions, and I'll address them as we go along. Great, so just a bit of information about what we mean by interviews. So the way I look at them is sort of really conversations with a purpose. So whether that's individual interviews or group interviews, as in focus groups. So you as the interviewer probe the experience and the ideas about a specific subject with a number of interviewees. And there are really three different types. So you've got unstructured interviews, semi-structured interviews, and then structured interviews. And in the way they're ordered here, they're really ordered in the level of control that you as the interviewer have in those situations. So in unstructured interviews, the idea is really that you get the interviewee on a subject of interest, and then you get out of the way and you let them talk about it in their own language, in their own pace. They pick what's important to them, what they want to talk about. Whereas on the other end of the scale, with structured interviews, that's much more like a questionnaire. So you ask exactly the same questions in exactly the same order, and there is no deviation from that script. So semi-structured interviews are in that kind of sweet spot right in the middle, where they combine the best of both worlds. So you do have a script, so you have a list of questions and in a particular order that you maybe want to ask them, but there's lots of flexibility within that to go off script. So for example, if your interviewee says something that triggers something in your mind and you think, oh, that would be really interesting to explore a bit more, or if you find out, well, this question they don't seem to know so much about, maybe I'll move them on to something else. That's what the semi-structured interview is there for, and that's the real sort of beauty of them. I'm a big fan of semi-structured interviews, so yeah, always love doing them. So just a bit more about semi-structured interviewing, so that they are a scheduled activity. So for the interviewee, there is no doubt in their mind that they're being interviewed. So you've arranged, you've arranged for the interview to happen. They also use an interview guide. So this is sort of a list of questions, topics that you want to cover, maybe particular prompts that you want to build in. So for example, if the person answered yes to this question, ask them about this, and sort of a tentative sequence of questions as well. And the interview guide is really a must. So whether you're the only interviewer and you want to ensure you remain consistent across all of your interviews, or especially if there are several of you doing interviews at the same time, you want to make sure everybody's kind of doing them in a consistent way. And as I mentioned, the interviewer is prepared. They know the questions. They're in control of the interview, but they're not controlling. So if the interviewer has slightly different ideas to to how the interview should go, that's absolutely fine, and that's built into how the interview runs. Now, generally, it's ideal to schedule an interview for sort of an hour maximum, because they are quite tiring activity. So for you as the interviewer to keep on top of the questions, to concentrate on the responses, but also for the interviewee to keep on thinking about responses to your questions, and to respond. So they can be quite tiring, and an hour is generally quite a good time frame. Now, just going into the best uses of semi-structured interviews, they're really useful in a variety of different settings. So when you look at your own monitoring and evaluation cycle and how you plan that, for example, if you're evaluating a program that runs over a year, you might want to do some semi-structured interviews halfway through, or at the end. They could accompany a survey. So you could, for example, send out a survey to all of the users on your program, and then you might want to follow that up with a few in-depth interviews to get a bit more information about the experience of people on the program. They're also really good at exploring a new area of work. So for example, if you're based in a particular neighborhood as a charity, and you've become aware of certain challenges in that area, but you're not quite sure what's really going on or what's the best way of addressing those, then semi-structured interviews are a really good way of exploring them, of finding out from people in the local area what's important to them, what are they really struggling with at the moment, and how do they feel that you can support them in that kind of work. They are best used when you're interested in thoughts and interpretations, opinions, reasons for doing certain things about a specific subject. So it's that kind of rich data that's often linked to either the lived experience of people or the learned experience of people. Now, before you dive into semi-structured interviews, just a word of caution. They are quite labor intensive. Like any kind of interview, whether it's face-to-face or group interviews, the interviews themselves take time. Then you've got the transcription to do, the data analysis. So it does take some time, so be mindful of that in terms of your own resources. But having said that, I always found that the data that comes out of it, and the richness of it makes up for all the time that you invest in organizing them and in analyzing the data, just because you get data that you would otherwise really struggle to gather, and you find out things that you would otherwise probably not find out. Another word of caution is sample sizes are usually quite small, so it's not, you can just send out a survey to tens, hundreds, thousands of people and get a hopefully fairly decent response rate. That's just not possible unless you've got a big team of interviewers. So sample sizes are usually quite small. You're looking at maybe 10, 15, 20 interviews, depending on your setup and what you want to get out of the interviews. And also don't expect facts, because you're exploring the perceptions, motivations, reasons of people, that might really depend on the context. So a lot of that kind of data shifts with time. Obviously the context in which they're responding, could change completely over, a few months, a year, 2 years, but also who they're talking to is really important. But what's quite powerful about semi-structured interviews is if you get it right and you create a non-judgmental atmosphere and you let them know that you're really just interested in their opinion, more often than not, that means they open up and they're quite honest in their opinion. So the data that you get is probably not as loaded as if they were talking to a peer, for example, or a social worker or a teacher. So that's an advantage of semi-structured interviews. So I'll come to the planning and designing of semi-structured interviews now. But one thing I wanted to mention beforehand was just a note on ethics, because I'm conscious we haven't, in our learning labs, we haven't covered this in much depth yet. And this is not to scare you off, just to make you aware. And, for all of you who are working in the delivery of services, I'm sure this is on your mind all the time anyway. How do we keep our service users safe? How do we ensure we're not causing any harm? And research or evaluation is similar, and there might just be a few other considerations to address. because in a way, everything that you're interested in, everything that you want to explore brings, certain risks that, you just need to address, you need to evaluate and mitigate. And I think it's always good practice to, when you plan the interviews, to put yourself in the shoes of the interviewee and sort of figure out, okay, what would make them comfortable, what might make them uncomfortable, what might bring up things that are, that might make them anxious. Just put yourself in their shoes to figure out where sort of the boundaries are. But the bottom line, and all the different ethics codes that are out there, will tell you, bottom line is the respect for the autonomy, the privacy and the dignity of your interviewees. And in the sense of the researcher participant relationship, that boils down to ensuring their anonymity, confidentiality, and the informed consent. And usually informed consent comes in the form of a document where you outline the context of the research, what you're interested in, what the interview setup is going to be, confidentiality, any kind of recording arrangements, and then what their rights are within the interview, and you ask them to sign that to make sure they've understood everything and they're happy with the arrangements. So that's really the bottom line. Then it's also important to think about ethics in terms of your research or evaluation design. So could you inadvertently do any harm during the interview by asking certain questions, for example? If you think that one of the first ethical questions to consider is whether to collect certain kinds of information at all. So if you think collecting that information might do more harm, then stay away from it. But if you make the decision to collect that information, it's then your responsibility, to manage that data and what is done with that information. And there's also consideration of harm potentially done as a result of using the data. So if, for example, you use the data to base certain decisions on, for example, to develop a new program, could somebody come to harm as a result of that? Maybe because your service is designed in a way that excludes them, or it doesn't take into consideration certain characteristics that they have that might put them at harm. And then there's the ethics in terms of the interviewer's role. As the interviewer, you're really the medium for the data. So, you're asking for the data, you're collecting the data through observing what people say, but also how people behave during the interview. And it's always a fine line between observing and interpreting. So, you might write down a note saying, oh, this person looked really upset when I asked that question. Well, maybe they were, but it's really hard for you to know whether that was, really how they felt, unless they told you, this question upsets me. A lot of it could just be your interpretation, your spin on things, especially when you're interviewing somebody maybe from a different cultural background to you. And there's also the role, if somebody responds to a question in a way that you find really outrageous, they say something that really goes against your opinion, and you really, it just rubs you up the wrong way, that plays no role in the interview setting. They're there because you ask them to share their experience. They're not there to walk away with a different opinion. So basically you just have to stay neutral, non-judgmental, just take a note of it, and then incorporate that into your data. You've just put together a few links on ethics resources if you're interested in that. So these are different ethics codes of conduct for research, and they're all fairly similar, but might just have a different spin, depending on whether it's psychological research or anthropological research. The most standard one is probably the Economic and Social Research Council code of conduct. So it might be worth looking at that, just to see whether they have anything more specific to say in terms of your own area of work. Now, coming to the planning of the interview, as with any kind of research or project, there's some fundamental questions that you have to address beforehand. And the number one really is the why. What are you trying to find out? This is really, it's almost like the mission of your organization. This is the mission statement of your research or evaluation project. What are you trying to find out? And this is really something that you need to keep coming back to as you're planning the interviews. Are the questions that I'm planning on asking, are they addressing this question? If not, then they shouldn't be there. Is everything that I'm planning, is it working towards me finding out this big question? It's that's sort of your guiding light. Following on from that is the question of who. So who's the best person to answer those questions, to give you that kind of information. And depending on what you're interested in, that might be different groups of people. So for example, you might want to evaluate a series of workshops that you ran for young people. So you definitely want to ask the young people about their experience. You will probably also want to ask the workshop leaders or any partners who helped you deliver the service. And depending on who you're asking, the questions would obviously have to be slightly different. But then there's also the question of who are your interviewers going to be, and I'll go into more detail a bit later on. But for example, could you be one of the interviewers, or are you, do you have enough knowledge about the program to understand the responses and to engage with somebody? Or are you too involved in the program? Would it actually be better if somebody else who's got a slightly more distant perspective did the interviews? Then there's the how. So do you use online means, phone interviews, face to face? If it's face to face, then there's the question of where. What would be a good location? What would be a setting that makes people feel comfortable and willing to open up in terms of the interview setting? And then finally there's the what. So what are you actually going to ask them during the interview? And as you go through all of these questions, always be aware of barriers. So are there any elements that might stop somebody from taking part in the interview? So for example, is English not their first language? So do you need to have the questions translated? Do you need bilingual interviewers? Do people need to make childcare arrangements? Would they struggle to travel to the location maybe that you've that you've selected? So just think about these things and address them as much as you can. Then who are the perfect interviewees? So obviously they have to be knowledgeable about the subject. So that might be because they've used a particular program, or because they have a specific lived experience, or they're an expert from a research field. So any kind of person who's what's called sort of an expert by virtue of involvement, whatever that involvement is, whether it's directly as actively engaged in the service or sort of more on the sidelines. They have to be able to reflect on and share their experience and knowledge with you, and obviously they have to be willing to talk. So there's no way you can ever coerce anybody into being interviewed by you. Then selecting the interviewers, there's certain qualities that ideally you would have as an interviewer. So generally you want to have somebody who's who's got that kind of approachable aura about them. So somebody who doesn't react coolly or on the contrary overly familiar to somebody, but who's very friendly, approachable, who's smart, so who comes across as professional, so people would trust them with their responses, with their information. Somebody who's sensitive to pick up on maybe body language and tone of voice and can react accordingly. Somebody who's agile in the sense that they can, if the interviewee says something that they feel is relevant to the research question, who can sort of go off script and go down a different route and sort of move around quite flexibly through the interview. And somebody who's got a certain amount of knowledge about the particular program that you're evaluating or the subject area that you're interested in. Always be aware of sort of the potential influence of power, and power could be based on age, gender, professional background, ethnicity. So what you ideally don't want is your interviewee to feel there is a power imbalance in the room, or that they are in an inferior position somehow. because that would, would make them feel uncomfortable. They might not open up to you so much. So, for example, from my own research, I was working with Afghan refugees in London, and while I was doing interviews, I was very much aware of how privileged I was being a woman, because it meant that I could speak freely, to Afghan women, and they were responding really well to me during interviews. I think if I had been a male researcher, that would not have been the case. They wouldn't have been so open and transparent with me. So, I mean, often interviewees react quite well to people who they sort of perceive to be quite similar to them. Obviously, that's not always possible to do, but that's just something to bear in mind, to see whether with a particular group who you're talking to, who you're interviewing, whether that might become, an issue to address, and to do something about. Okay, now I'll go into drafting questions and the interview guide. And when I use the word interview guide, it is really a guide. It's not a questionnaire that you read out word by word, and that's fixed. It's more of sort of an agenda that, has an outline of the planned topics, the questions, and sort of a rough order in which you want to work through them. But the idea is really that if, for example, you test your interview questions with a couple of interviewees and you just feel like some questions don't work so well, or the order doesn't work so well, then by all means change the interview guide. There's no point in going through painful interview after painful interview if you can do something about it, with, changing questions and order of questions, for example. Now, just to start with some top tips, always factor in enough time to, draft your questions, to edit them, to get opinions about them, to ideally test them with maybe a couple of interviewees or people similar to them, then to edit them some more, and polish them off. That just takes a bit of time. So, just factor that in. Also, don't cram too many subjects into the agenda. It's really tempting to think, oh, it'd be lovely to know that. But if it's not directly related to your interview, your big interview question, your big research question, your big why, then leave it out. What you can do is just prioritize certain subjects. Make sure they absolutely get addressed during the interview. And then if you still have some time to have some, subjects that you're interested in, but they're not maybe, so critical to your question. Another point to bear in mind is that often I think semi-structured interviews are seen as just using open-ended questions. So the sort of the free-form questions, the questions that start with your how, your what, your why. But often actually closed questions that you just answer with a yes or a no or a rating are a really good opener into open questions. So you could, for example, ask a question like, have you accessed our online advice line, for example? And then the answer is, let's say yes, and then you could follow up by saying, okay, well, can you tell me what specifically you were looking for and how you used that information? Or if the answer is no, you could ask, okay, can you just tell me about, what, are you experiencing any problems accessing it? Or, just tell me about why, your reasons for not using it. And the other advantage is that it gives you a bit of quantitative data in a semi-structured interview as well. So you could then, for example, say 80% of people answered this question with yes, or something like that. One thing to bear in mind is socially acceptable answers. So your questions might, inadvertently trigger that kind of response where somebody thinks, I really want to say this, but I know it's not, socially acceptable. So I'm going to go with this, which I know, I'm not going to have any problems with. Or it might be that the interviewee thinks if I give a negative response, I might be excluded from, a program, for example. So the number one thing always is to assure them of confidentiality, that whatever they say is not going to have any negative consequences. But there are also other ways of maybe getting around that, by including the socially non-acceptable answer in the question. So you could, for example, start by saying, some people tell me that X, Y, and Z, that, for example, they really enjoy smoking. How do you feel about that? So to the interviewee, that signals, if they say, oh yeah, I really like smoking, you're not going to be shocked, or you're not going to be appalled as an interviewer, because you've heard it before. And to them, it then feels quite safe to respond in that kind of way. So there are just some ways around that. And here's just a list of questions to avoid. A couple of weeks ago, we had a learning lab on survey questions. So I went into much more detail with this. And as Antonia mentioned, we're going to upload the videos to the YouTube channel soon, so you can access the recording there. So I just want to whisk you through that here. One question type to avoid is leading questions. So questions that signal there's only one right answer. It's a bit over the top, but what do you think of our amazing new hotline? Then double questions, where you cram more than one question into your question. So for example, do you do exercise and eat healthily? Because it can either confuse your interviewee, or they end up answering one question and forgetting about the other one. So break them up into two. Then loaded questions, so where you bring in your own value statements. So for example, how much time do you waste on social media every week? So keep your own value judgments out of that. Then ambiguous questions, where they're not quite sure what you're trying to get at, and then either they ask for clarification, which is the best case scenario. Worst case scenarios, they answer in a really waffly way, because they're trying to read from your body language whether they're getting to the answer that you want to hear. Avoid jargon. I mean, any kind of jargon that might make them feel uncomfortable, because they don't know what you mean, and either they then have to ask for clarification, or they just think, oh, I feel too shy, I don't want to ask, so I'm just pretending I know what this means. Similarly, any kind of assumed knowledge. If you word a question in a way that they assume they're supposed to know about something, and then if they don't, they either get quite angry, or just lose their confidence in the interview, and become nervous. And then overly sensitive questions. So I mean, it's in a lot of interview scenarios, you do want to include some potentially sensitive questions, carefully worded, but avoid overly sensitive questions that goes back to not doing any harm during the interview. Now I'm just quickly going into developing questions, and then I'd be quite interested in the chat function to see whether there are any sort of burning research questions or evaluation questions that are on your mind at the moment that you're considering to address and maybe use semi-structured interviews for. But just to run you through how to develop the questions for your interview guide. So obviously you've got your sort of overall research or evaluation question. That's sort of the mission statement of your project. So that could be, for example, why do some young people join gangs? For example, in a particular neighborhood or of a particular age group. So once you've phrased that, you then develop a number of areas or topics that you want to explore underneath that. So for some, you might already have an idea that, for example, family background could play a role. So you then have a question around, tell me about your life. Tell me about your life story, your family, friends, school, etc. But for the most part, you might not actually know, what particular reasons might be. So you want to sort of tackle your overall research question from different perspectives and shine light on it from different corners. So you could, want to find out, how did they join a gang, or what made them want to join the gang? What's the best part of it? What do they feel, really passionate about? What's maybe the hardest part? What does it mean to be part of a gang? And again, they're going to pick what comes out most strongly for them. What's their daily routine? Again, in terms of that, or any kind of jobs or roles within the gang, they're going to pick what's most relevant for them and what they feel most strongly about. And then maybe connect that to a future question. So what are your dreams and goals? And do they think being a gang member will help them fulfill their dreams and goals? And with this last question, I'm conscious it really depends on the tone of your voice. So you don't want to ask them in a way like, do you really think being a gang member is going to help you? But keep it quite neutral and non-judgmental, and that you really just want to find out whether that's that's the case for them. Okay, I'd be really interested at this point. I mean, you may not have any sort of specific research questions or evaluation questions in mind at the moment, but if there is something that you're in your organization, you're thinking about, running some semi-structured interviews about, could you write your sort of big research question in the chat function? I can't actually access the...
I'll share it. So
yeah,
a question from Sarah.
Mm-hmm.
And Sarah, feel free to unmute yourself and elaborate. Do you want to ask your question?
I will. Oh, that's fantastic, Angela. Thank you.
Hello.
Hello. I'm particularly interested. I mean, if you think about this person that you're talking to about being part of a gang, how do you ask questions or make connections in such a way that people will tell you the truth? Well, truth is relative anyway, but that they answer honestly rather than telling you something that they think you want to hear.
I think, with any kind of interview setup, it always depends on the kind of context, which I know is not a very satisfying answer, but it depends on whether maybe you're already in contact with that young person through another project that you're running, or whether you whether there is a way that you're in contact with them through their school or through their college. But I think it always boils down to creating quite a neutral environment, so making sure they understand that you're simply just interested in finding out, that you're not putting any value or any judgment on that, and that you're not using the information against them, and that if they don't want that information to go anywhere else, that's basically that that confidentiality is secured. But it really depends on the kind of context, and in that situation, you really need to think carefully about who the interviewer is going to be as well. So, you want somebody who the young person can quite easily relate to. So not somebody who they know has a specific agenda, who wants them to, for example, not join a gang or leave a gang, who would, somebody who would just, talk to them in the situation that they're in at the moment without, pushing any kind of agenda. I don't know whether that helps.
There's another question from, sorry, yeah, Sarah, I hope that's helped a bit. If you've got a follow-up question, please ask it. From Andy, we've got, in terms of selecting interviewees, again, sometimes you need to get feedback from people who are not participating, articulate or fluent.
Okay. Sorry, it's predictive texting. What I was trying to say was people who are not particularly articulate or fluent.
Mm. Oh, okay. So when you say not participating, you mean they are willing?
No, the predictive texting came up with participating instead of particularly. So it should have read particularly articulate or fluent.
I think, there's different ways of including people in research, and I think one question is whether semi-structured interviews are the right tool then for them, or whether there are other means that you can engage them in your research. So for example, would they react better to filling in a questionnaire, or would it work better for them to have an unstructured interview, so where they're literally sitting down with you over a cup of tea and you just sort of probe them on a certain subject, but you're not putting them into that kind of more formal interview scenario? Do they react better to that, or are there more creative ways maybe in which they can express what they what they want to say, and that really depends on the context. So I think it's always bearing in mind whether semi-structured interviews are then the best way of including them in your research or in your evaluation.
Thank you. Ava, would you like to ask your question out loud?
Yes, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I was just thinking, for us, I suppose it's because our target groups and the people we ask questions to are subject or have been subject to domestic violence. So we always worried about how to phrase questions so they don't re-trigger trauma. And also we sometimes need to talk to children, and it's about how to pitch it at the right level, because we want to find out what's really going on without putting words in their mouth. And obviously children won't necessarily have the ability to answer questions in certain ways. So it's always very difficult for us.
I think
so any tips on that be gratefully received.
I think in terms of in terms of interviewing the women, it might actually be better to then use unstructured interviews, because you're then putting them in control of the situation. So they, you would just sort of get them onto a particular subject, or that you want to explore with them, but they are then fully in control as to what they want to talk about and how they want to talk about it. And then, when you get the feeling that maybe they're becoming more comfortable in that scenario, and they're happier to talk to you about that, then you can maybe ask some more semi-structured interview questions. But maybe an unstructured interview is then sort of like a warm-up, sort of building that kind of trust, because in that situation you do need a lot of trust, them in you. In terms of interviewing children, I don't have any experience in that, but I can certainly look into that and see whether I can find some resources, if that would be helpful, and share that with you.
And there are a few other questions. Thank you, Oliver and Dura, and a few other comments. What I suggest, Angela, because you've still got some more slides, some might actually, parts of your questions might be answered over the next few slides. So Angela, why don't you carry on, and then we can come back to some of these questions towards the end. And if we don't have a chance to answer them all, we're trying to be quite thorough with our follow-up to try and signpost you to useful resources. So we will address them if we don't have time in this hourly session. So Angela, do you want to just go through the remaining slides?
Yeah. So semi-structured interviews, they really live off sort of follow-up questions, because that's that's essentially the beauty of them, that you can deviate from your script if you think that the interviewee has something more to say about a specific subject. So there are different techniques that you can use in prompting for more information. So one is just asking them for an example. So if they've told you I've learned a lot on this course, then or can you give me an example of what you've learned and what you've taken away? Ask for meaning, so either to clarify or to ask what something meant for them at a particular time, or what something means to them. Provide some evidence, not in a sense of what makes you say that, but in a sense of, can you clarify your thought process with me, or can you just tell me more about your thought process here? Ask for more detail, ask them to just expand a bit. Reflect back to check understanding. This works both ways. So it's for you as the interviewer to find out, have I really understood this correctly? Let me double check. But it also helps the interviewee hearing their own words, sort of reflected back at them to see, okay, did I phrase that the way I wanted it to? Do I want to add anything to that? Well, obviously you don't want to sound like a parrot, but it's at different points during the interview, it really helps to reflect back. And then you've got your verbal and non-verbal agreement, your nods, your you're sort of leaning forward to find out more different ways of showing that you're interested in what they're saying. And here I've just written down an agenda for a semi-structured interview, but bear in mind, as I mentioned before, it's not set in stone. If the conversation suddenly jumps to question 4 before you've even addressed question 2, go with it, because that's how your interviewee works through that particular subject, and you can always come back to the questions later on. But having said that, it's good just to have sort of a tentative order in which you think the questions are more likely to work, or you have the smoothest sequence. So you always have the obviously the customary pleasantries at the beginning, just to welcome them and help them settle in.
Just to jump in here, Angela, there have been a few questions about, sort of tips for building rapport at the beginning of an interview. So I think those first two stages are important ones.
Okay, great. So in terms of pleasantries, you would welcome them, obviously offer them a cup of tea or coffee, just ask them some simple questions about how they are and how their day's been, for example. And the really important bit are the icebreaker questions then, in that sense. So they're just really questions that introduce them to the interview scenario, but they don't have to think about them for very long, and they're not asking about any kind of difficult information. So it could be things like, how long have you lived in this neighborhood, or since how long have you worked for this organization, or something like that. So something that they can easily answer, and sort of get a feel for the situation. As the interviewer, it's always up to you to decide how much you want to say about yourself as well. I mean, it's obviously always good to introduce yourself and to give them some information as well, so they the information flow isn't just one way. So that's always helpful to build in at the beginning as well. So if they say something that you think, oh, we've got that in common, or that there are similarities, then do mention that. For example, if they say they've just dropped their kids off at school, you could say, oh yeah, I've got kids as well, or something like that. So something that shows them you're approachable, you're friendly, and you're just trying to help them settle in. And from the icebreaker questions, you then go into more directly related questions to your research, but they're still non-threatening in a way. So the idea here is to help them get comfortable, get used to you, but also get them to start thinking about the subject area. So obviously you don't know how their day's gone, where they've come from. So it might take them a bit of time to think about the specific subject that you're interested in. So these kinds of questions help them think about that. So, for example, if they've taken part in workshops that you've offered, you could just ask about, can you tell me about how many you've attended? Can you tell me about what you've learned? Can you tell me about, the interaction with the others? Those sorts of things. And then from there, you move into critique questions. So it's always good to start with the positive questions. So asking them about what were the good things about X, or what do you like about something, because people find it easier than to critique you afterwards, or to critique something afterwards, if they feel they've already given some praise. So it helps them balance it. And also often people find it difficult to think about something in more positive terms when they've just criticized it, because they can either feel they're contradicting themselves, or they're softening their critique and saying, oh, actually, it's not that bad, because of all these positive points. So yeah, always start with the good points, and then go into the sort of drawbacks, disadvantages, areas for development, disappointments, but always in a neutral and non-judgmental tone, even if they are talking in a negative term about a program that maybe you were involved in. It always has to be neutral and non-judgmental. And then at the end, ask the awkward or sensitive questions, because by that point you're no longer a stranger, but somebody who's professional, who's listening in a non-argumentative and non-judgmental way, and who's simply interested in their opinion. So that's a good point to then ask those kinds of questions. I've put the demographic questions at the end here, but it's really a judgment call, and it depends on what kind of demographic questions you want to ask. The reason I put them here is because sometimes questions about current marital status, or age, or education, or income, they can be quite delicate for people, and sort of bring out identity issues more than potentially opinion questions could. So one thing to bear in mind is, do you need to ask those kinds of questions? What kind of information do you really need? What do you need to know for your research question? Are there any other ways you can get that information? So for example, would they have filled in an application form and it says, you know, for example, their education level, or, you know, their age or something like that. And otherwise, you might want to ask in broader terms. So rather than asking them for specific information, for example, what's your income? Ask about sort of brackets of income, and they can then say, okay, I fit into that category, rather than having to say exactly, for example, how much they earn. And then consider sort of concluding by, you know, either a sort of, you know, short sort of warm down question, or like a future related question. For example, now that you've completed the program with us, you know, what are your plans? What are you going to do next? Yeah, and then close with that. But for all questions, really bear in mind, if the interviewee were to ask you, why are you asking me that, which is the absolute right to do, and you don't feel you've got a good enough answer to that, then omit that question, because then there's probably no good reason that that you should be asking that question. Okay, now just to go through a bit of a checklist of what to do before the interview. I haven't got many more slides left now, so we've got more time to address your question. So before an interview, what you really need to address, and whether that's you know, depends on how you invite people to an interview, whether that's in an email or over the phone, or you send them a letter. These are all the things that you need to address, that they need to be aware of in order to give their informed consent. So they need to know the purpose of the interview and the format of it. They need to know what topic they're going to be asked about, the length of interview, so they can make arrangements, you know, talk about confidentiality, any kind of recording arrangements. I mean, that's a whole topic in itself, but you know, if you're recording the interviews, you know, they need to know about that. If they're not happy to be recorded, you know, they have to be able to tell you that. That they can ask clarifying questions, they can decline questions, and they can ask questions themselves. So all of these sorts of things need to be clarified beforehand. And then just a few further considerations. I mean, you might want to think about dress code. You know, what would feel appropriate in the interview scenario? Would they feel more comfortable if you were, you know, dressed quite casually, or would they expect, you know, to be dressed more business-like or smart casual? So that's just something to think about. Pay as much attention to your own words as those of your interviewees. As I said, you know, it has to be, your tone has to be neutral, but it doesn't mean you have to sound like a robot. Certainly it has to be quite neutral, but still approachable and friendly. And just bear in mind that, you know, your choice of words can influence their response. Be aware of your own reactions. I mean, I've mentioned that before. You know, try to again remain neutral. And don't rely on your memory. I mean, you might want to, you know, you might be recording the interview, but from my own experience, I always found it useful to take notes anyway, to complement your recordings, but also because it gives you, while you're writing, it gives you a break to think about their response, maybe whether there's something else you want to ask. And it buys them some time as well to just chill for a bit and think about, maybe reflect about their response and see whether there's anything else that they want to add. In the initial planning of this learning lab, I was going to talk about coding and analyzing as well, but clearly that was hyper ambitious. So we are going to run a separate learning lab on that. And Lucy, who's on the learning lab here as well, her and I together are going to run a session in September. But if between now and then you are planning on doing semi-structured interviews and you end up with reams and reams of paper, you know, with data, and you don't know what to do with it, then please get in touch and we can talk you through that before then. But yeah, otherwise, just to let you know, there is a separate learning lab on that because it's a huge subject. And then just finally to let you know of further upcoming learning labs on qualitative data. So in June, we're running one on how to run a focus group. And then in September, we're running one on coding and analyzing qualitative data. But we're very responsive and reactive to suggestions. So if there's anything else, you know, whether about qualitative data or any other kind of impact subject or any kind of, challenge you're experiencing due to the current situation, then please, just get in touch, send us an email, send us a message, and we'll build that into our planning. And at the bottom, you have included the Eventbrite link that you can regularly check in, because we're running more frequent learning labs now. So check in there for information and for detail on how to sign up.
Just to jump in there, on the Eventbrite link, it's going to look, if you were to click on it now, it looks a little bit empty. We've just run 4, 2 last week and 2 this week, and we need to update it with learning labs over the next few months. We're trying to be as responsive as possible given the current situation. So in all our follow-up, it's really worth you answering the survey that we send out afterwards, because we're trying to see which topics are going to be particularly of interest, in addition to our standard learning lab program, like the qualitative data sessions that Angela has been running. There was a question about an Excel one. Yeah, we are putting together an Excel training with our partners Superhighways as part of a sort of London initiative to strengthen civil society. So that we're pulling that together, and hoping that we can then also share that with the sort of wider Measuring the Good community and other organisations as well, because that does come up a lot. The sort of just basic Excel skills and analysis. We did run a workshop a year ago. One of our volunteers ran a brilliant workshop on how to use Excel, but it was an in-person workshop which we haven't recorded, so we could get him to try and adapt that session because he's got the content ready to go. Yeah, we are looking into that. That Excel is definitely on our list, and other sort of useful analysis tools. Would anyone like to, because there have been lots of questions, I feel some of them have been addressed. There was stuff around sort of digital, the actual recording, building rapport, and a few others. Tracy, you had something interesting to share. Would anyone like to share anything now? Not through the chat function, just unmute yourselves, and sort of reframe or ask your question again. We've still got a few minutes to go.
I don't know if it's of interest to others, but probably actually a couple of years ago, I worked with some women on a project that I was doing about women who'd been through the criminal justice system and had learning disability. And what we knew was actually that it wasn't going to be so much a study of criminal justice as trauma. So we really thought about how we might engage with these women. And we ran, so we visited women's centres and took a professional makeup artist with us and ran pamper sessions, and then the women peeled off and did a semi-structured interview with me. And it was so positive. I just, the outcomes for the women were at least as great as the outcomes I got for things. And I had a lot of the women's workers come back and say, they had never seen the women quite so engaged, because they were able to share their collective experiences almost, because they were chatting beforehand, but then also to celebrate their beauty and to put the two things together. So to talk about some quite difficult subjects, but actually have them walking out having makeup done by a professional artist. It was so positive and so powerful, actually, that it's something I would definitely replicate if I was to do anything like that again, because it softened some of the trauma, I think. Obviously, we did a lot of making sure people were okay, but they bounced out, which was really nice.
Yeah, I think that's such a, thank you for sharing, Tracy. I think that's such a sort of interesting and important point, that actually the ways you can evaluate can also help to kind of reinforce the change and the impact you're trying to bring about. For a leadership program that Sarah and Angela have also been involved in, called Sheely's Change, I helped to run some interviews, semi-structured, and it was an hour that women were taking out of their time to look back and reflect on what they've learned. So the feedback from those interviews was how useful it had been for them to just kind of stop and think and realize how much they'd learned and developed. So they can be incredibly beneficial for the interviewee, as well as a really useful data gathering exercise.
Yeah, I think it always depends a bit on how long your time frame for the interviews is as well. I mean, I think when I was doing my PhD fieldwork, obviously I had a year, so that you know makes it was a real luxury. But I was also working with a population group that was very suspicious of being interviewed, and that was very found it very hard to open up because of the experience that they had been through. So having that period just to get to know them beforehand in different settings, before then actually going into a more formal interview setting, was really helpful. I mean, as a result of my fieldwork, I think I put on about 10 kilos because I got invited to so many family dinners and everything was just around food. But it was sort of a way of, you know, them getting to know me more, finding out more about my background, and just knowing me personally a bit more before they then trusted me enough not only to, you know, be interviewed by me, but also to suggest other people to who I might want to talk to, because you know a lot of in the Afghan community at the time, a lot of it went through relationships. So you got to know somebody through somebody else, so that really helped. But it is a luxury having that much time, and it's that kind of more ethnographic model. But if you have the opportunity to, you know, get to know people who, you know, would otherwise struggle in an formal interview setting, you know, to help them, you know, become more familiar with you beforehand, and become, you know, more positive, then that's definitely worth exploring. And I really like the example, Tracy. That's fantastic. Okay.
I have a question. I was going to ask about, I don't know if this was covered early on before I joined, the benefits of structured interview as opposed to other forms of evaluating. And then following on from that, how many people do you select? Do you interview everyone that was on the program, or do you just select a few to make it more structured?
I think I covered that at the beginning, but the best use of the interview. So if you're looking at, for example, evaluating a program, you would, for example, you could run a survey where you send out to everybody, and then you could pick a certain number, and it depends a bit on how big the overall population is. But the real strength of semi-structured interviews is because a survey will only give you so much information. So obviously you get the statistical information, you get some, you know, you have some open-ended questions, but it's still very limited. And the semi-structured interviews really help you to understand in much more detail the experience of somebody on the program, and to, you know, go into much more detail, but also to let them talk about what's most important, or what was most important to them, you know, the good and the bad, or the unexpected. So it just helps it to dive much deeper into that kind of data, and that helps you often to, you know, either understand the survey data in much more, you know, in all the different colors, but also it might surprise you in that it brings up something completely different that the surveys haven't. In terms of numbers, it is always dependent on what the size of the population is and what your resources are as well. But I found with semi-structured interviews, once you've done a number, a certain number, the same kind of themes keep coming up. And then at some point, then you probably realize, okay, I've reached saturation points. I've probably, you know, had enough surveys to sort of get a good grasp of what's going on, because I can see there's repetition, you know, people are mentioning similar things. Does that, yeah? Okay, have I missed any questions?
There are a few, oh great, yeah, thanks Ollie. So love the point about thinking through what you would answer to an interview's questions. Why are you asking me about this, and taking it out if you can't answer it. And Ollie, it was just really interesting. It would just be great to hear about your organisation and everything that you're up to in terms of your response to COVID. Would you like to share? Have you got time to stay and share?
Yeah, just quickly as well. Yes, we're an NHS charity, so we've been incredibly busy at the moment, supporting our staff at 5 London hospitals. So I normally do evaluation for them, but I've also been doing loads of other stuff because we've been swamped, like volunteer interviews, DBS checks, things like that. And we're doing some self-evaluation collection at the moment, but obviously we can't burden staff, we can't get to patients, that kind of thing. So I'm kind of thinking more about what we could do afterwards. So I think the interviews would be a really good way to do that.
Mm. Sorry, I didn't get a chance to respond. You coming back? Should I just send you an email afterwards, and then?
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks, Angela.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Great. All right, so I'm conscious we've gone a bit over time, but thank you for staying with us. And thank you, Angela, for covering such a kind of sort of big, meaty topic in a really quite short space of time. So we will follow up on this with some useful materials. I think Lucy's offered to share a useful template, the slides, the recording, and as Angela said, if you need some additional support or questions around coding and analysis, or if you just want to maybe run through some of the questions, we could take a quick look at your interview guide. Just get in touch with us, yeah, in the meantime, just look after yourselves, take care.
Great. Thanks very much indeed.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Bye.